Many people wait to see what Louisiana's new congressional district map will look like after state lawmakers draw that new one.
Sabrina Wilson explains some of the options political scientists say that state lawmakers have as they prepare to draw a new map.
How will Louisiana's electoral map change? Many people ponder that question as state lawmakers prepare to redraw the map following the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling.
One of the things that could happen is reverting to the 2022 map.
That map included only one majority African-American electoral district, and a federal judge said it likely violated the Voting Rights Act. So the state crafted a different map in 2024 with 2 black majority districts. But last week, that map was struck down.
Race cannot be a consideration in the drawing of these districts. Politics can be. And given the fact that African Americans are strong supporters of the Democratic Party, the districts can be drawn in a way that benefits the Republican Party.
The Supreme Court's conservative majority said the state relied too heavily on race when it drew the district now represented by Congressman Cleo Fields. The other minority majority district is represented by Troy Carter.
Would it be a complete anomaly if the Louisiana legislature were to pass a congressional map that has no black majority district, not one?
Well, it would certainly be a deviation from the past, and I think that the court has opened the door for that possibility. For them to do that.
However, Dr. Robert Hogan, chair of LSU's Department of Political Science, thinks even Republicans might push back on that.
And it would draw the ire, I think, or at least the concern of a lot of the Republican members of Congress currently there, because their districts would have to change dramatically. They currently have very safe Republican districts. Those Democratic-leaning voters would have to go somewhere.
Currently, Louisiana's U.S. House delegation has 4 Republicans, 2 Democrats.
Scalise and Johnson in particular want their districts to remain largely Republican.
Other states now look to redo their electoral maps.
There has already been responses to the decision and how different state legislatures are planning on going into the midterms.
Professor Hogan thinks there could be pressure on the legislature to create a map that favors Republicans for all 6 of Louisiana's congressional districts. And he also thinks there will be pressure from African Americans to save the majority black districts. Meg?